Jemima Pierre received her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, is a sociocultural anthropologist whose research and teaching interests are located in the overlaps between African studies and African diaspora studies and engage three broad areas: race, racial formation, and political economy, culture and history of anthropological theory, and transnationalism, globalization, and diaspora. She is the author, of course, of The Predicament of Blackness that we're going to hear about today. She is currently completing a manuscript whose working title is Racial Americanization, Conceptualizing African Immigrants in the U.S., and working on a project on the racialized political economy of multinational resource extraction in Ghana. Jemima Pierre.
Thanks so much, you all, for coming here. Last minute, I know a lot of you found out, but thank you so much for taking your lunch and spending it. So I'm going to go ahead and begin, and apologists, and begin with a bit of ethnography. I remember the first time I walked into Champs, a popular sports bar in Accra, known for its Mexican cuisine, its broadcasting of major international sporting events, its karaoke nights, and its lively clientele. It was a late Saturday evening in the summer of 2006, and I was accompanied by a Ghanaian friend, Kemi, who was meeting a business acquaintance. My first reaction as we ducked through the front door and stepped down into the basement-like venue was shock. This shock was quickly followed by extreme discomfort. Kemi, sensing my reluctance to move beyond the front door, put his arms around my shoulder, laughed heartily, and said, "Welcome to the expats hangout." Champs is a boisterous place. Its patrons are primarily expatriates and overwhelmingly white. Although I was aware that such places exist in Ghana, as well as throughout post-colonial Africa, and I've been to other similar, specifically white expat hangouts in other places, this scene was much more intense than any other I had encountered in Accra. I stood by the door for a few more seconds and took stock of my surroundings. Across from the front entrance was a large, well-stocked T-shaped bar with two bartenders, a young black man and a white woman, rushing about serving clients. Around the bar were stools occupied by white men, many of them chatting with young black women. At the back of the room, to the right of the bar, there are several pool tables, gaming machines. That area too was filled with people. In the back left corner was a kitchen, bustling with Ghanaian cooks, dressed in white shirts, pants, and hats, hurrying about to hand plates of food to the white waiters. Most of Champs' patrons were seated immediately to the left of the bar, facing a large screen that was broadcasting a soccer game. The place was packed with people and activity, and it was loud. Champs Sports Bar and Restaurant is described online and in travel guides as the place where, in the words of a white British study abroad student in Ghana, you forget that you're in Accra. Perhaps it is the out-of-the-way location at the back of the Parliament Arcade, a Lebanese-owned hotel, restaurant, and gaming complex fronting Accra's busy ring road, but it is also the diversity of its predominantly white clientele. There are other expat hangouts in Accra, but Champs is different. There one can find a diverse group of white people, Peace Corps volunteers, stealing away from the village to find civilization in the city, and that's in quotes, European and Australian backpackers, solving a nostalgia from home, anthropologists, temporarily leaving their pre-modern ethnological sites, study abroad students looking for real American food, UN and NGO workers spending their stipends, and foreign businessmen, and sometimes, occasionally, the businesswoman, satisfying an after-work thirst. National, class, and professional differences among these expats seem to evaporate in Champs. Indeed, they seem to evaporate as quickly as the Accra streets are left outside, crowded with black bodies. My general unease about walking into a place like Champs stemmed from a contradictory sense that the scene was both familiar and peculiar. My very first thought after Kemi and I walked in was that as a young woman who looked Ghanaian, I did not want to be mistaken for a prostitute. Indeed, Champs seemed familiar precisely because it was an expats hangout, a relatively all-white space with few Ghanaian patrons and with the two common feature of older white men accompanied by younger black women, very young black women, who are often assumed to be prostitutes. But Champs also felt strange to me because such an exclusive all-white space should not exist in a mostly black African city without a history of European settlement. As a black subject and researcher, encountering Champs in post-colonial Ghana was disturbing to me, also because it was clearly a local articulation of a historical, global, political, economy of race and power. In my detailed ethnographic analysis of whiteness, this is in chapter 3 in the book, I demonstrate how while the white population in Ghana is mostly transient and white positionality hardly rigid, whiteness has retained its undisputed, if contested, power position. The ways that whiteness continues to have currency in this nominally black post-colonial African nation reveals a clear discourse of race that is articulated through practices that both reflect global economic, political, and cultural hierarchies, and that reinforce white privilege on the local level. In other words, Champs provide a context to see historic and continuing white power in Africa, a power that stretches back to racialized colonial rule, carried through the contemporary international economic and political dominance, and concretely solidified through unofficial racial, cultural, and spatial segregation in this post-colonial moment. Indeed, it is the historical and contemporary, and therefore structural, position of racial whiteness in Ghana that allows a place like Champs to serve as a space of white privilege and white social distance from blacks in an ostensibly black independent country. The whiteness enacted through the space of Champs is in effect a metonym for the reality of Ghana and Africa's global racialized position vis-a-vis the racially white, Western/European, and U.S. North. But this all too brief description of Champs and my work on whiteness in Ghana frame a much broader discussion and intervention in the book, one about race, Africa, modernity, and the interrogation of global black subjects. In the first instance, the focus of the book, The Predicament of Blackness, is on racial formation in post-colonial Africa. Specifically, it is the existence and persistence of race-making where the predicaments of blackness depend on modern racializing processes that include interactions with whiteness among other identities and communities. This is a theoretical epistemological intervention, but it is also one that bucks against established disciplinary orthodoxy to ask two interrelated questions. One, what is the status of race in Africanist anthropology? And two, what is the status of Africa in African diaspora studies? In the course of conducting research, it became clear that contemporary post-colonial African societies are thoroughly structured through and by racialization processes and global white supremacy. Yet there have been few studies that take that reality and make it analytically significant. The recent post-colonial frameworks through which many societies are conceptualized within African studies often do not account for the continued existence of racially structured, unequal national and global relationships and practices. Southern Africa, of course, is a marginal exception. On the other hand, within African diaspora studies, a field that recognizes that race significantly informs various forms of identification and politics in black communities, Africa is often not interrogated as an active site of contemporary racialized identity formation. In addressing these trends, the broader question for me then was, what are the analytical frameworks that allow examination of phenomena such as racialized whiteness in contemporary modern Africa? To engage this question and present an outline of my broader points in the book, I will now turn to a brief moment in Ghana's history. During Ghana's first 10 years of independence, the U.S. government intervened culturally and politically to influence the terms of interaction among black Americans and continental Africans. The first of the African nations to emerge from former colonialism, Ghana was the Cold War battleground in Africa, as the U.S. sparred with the Soviet Union and China for political independence, for political influence in the new Africa. And race relations was the site of this sparring. Combined Soviet and Chinese propaganda and the Kwame Nkrumah government's increasingly relentless attacks on the treatment and status of black Americans caused consternation and concern among U.S. government aid operatives. Negative foreign perception of U.S. race relations, policy advisors feared, would become a major diplomatic problem, adversely affecting U.S. relations with the new nations of Africa. These attacks from communist and the Ghanaian state presses were so sharp and pronounced that they often drove U.S. diplomats in Ghana to lodge formal protests with the Ghanaian government. More importantly, however, they forced U.S. government agencies to take swift actions to combat such negative views, both to ensure that the condition of African Americans did not become an impediment to diplomacy and to soften the impact of communist propaganda in Africa. The United States Information Agency, USIA, in Ghana, with the support of the State Department's Board of, you have to laugh at this title, Cultural Affairs and Psychological Propaganda, that was the name of the board, embarked on a major cultural offensive that sought not so much to deny U.S. anti-black racism as to articulate a strong narrative of African American social progress. U.S. foreign policy officials felt that a focus on the achievements of African Americans in areas of education, politics, and economics would demonstrate to continental Africans that things had been improving and would continue to improve over time. They decided on a visual campaign that would have broad reach and especially influence Ghanaian students, teachers, and civil servants. This campaign included numerous exhibits and conferences, distribution of pamphlets on African Americans, and prominent sponsorship of major cultural and educational events in Ghana featuring African Americans. The exhibits were wildly popular with young Ghanaians, and USIA library staff in Ghana reported increased readership with special interest in the works of African American authors. More importantly, the Ghana African American campaign was so successful for the CIA in particular and USAID that it became the model for U.S. cultural propaganda in other African nations throughout the 1960s. This little-known historical fact of U.S. cultural propaganda in Ghana and Africa more broadly may not be surprising, particularly in the context of some new studies on the role of African American cultural ambassadors in the history of U.S. diplomacy around the world. But I want to deploy it in two ways. First, such cultural projects reflect a long trajectory of cross-Atlantic interactions that have been mediated by global social political by the global social and political economy of slavery, empire, and especially emerging U.S. hegemony in Africa. Just as important, and this is my second point, is that these interactions shape and are shaped by Ghana's local racial context and national identity. Moreover, when interrogated along discourses and practices of whiteness, they form part of a broad set of examples that mark a contemporary racialized consciousness in Ghana, the key thesis of the book. Using a set of ethnographic sites to explore the manifold processes of racialization in Ghana, the predicament of blackness, post-colonial Ghana, and the politics of race makes the case for recognizing the continuing significance of race as a major modality through which modern post-colonial African societies are constituted. Indeed, Ghana's historical position in the European trade in Africans, its experience of racial colonialism, its ongoing prominence in African diaspora politics, as well as its own active practices of what I call racecraft in the book, clearly reflect how its local realities are informed by global racial configurations of identity, culture, economics, and politics. The research in the book foregrounds the processes and practices of race that, Southern Africa aside, have received less attention in historiographical, ethnographic, and political studies of Africa. And the book attempts to provide an original approach to the study of Africa, one that links the continent's current condition and predicament to a set of global cultural and political configurations that include race as a key aspect of identity and community formation. The broader objective, of course, is to make the case for a re-theorization of the relationship between the African diaspora and the African continent, with specific reference to the place of race in history, identity, and politics on both sides of the Atlantic. The arguments in the book are framed around the key points that, one, processes of racialization are global and find meaning in the historical legacies of the slave trade and colonialism, where racial categories were constructed within a hierarchy with whiteness as the power position. Secondly, my claim is that processes of racialization structure the lives of continental Africans in ways that are analogous to the experiences of black communities outside of Africa. Racialization processes, of course, are not the same everywhere. They are a family of forms that are subject to local articulations. Nevertheless, however distinct and multiple, racialization processes are all interconnected to the broader historical reality of European empire making and attendant global white cultural and political hegemony. And importantly, racialization links all modern experience. These claims may seem self-evident for some, yet this has not been the way scholars have engaged either the African continent or the African diaspora. Significantly, There is often the view that issues of race create considerable concerns only in some Western or multiracial societies with particular histories of overt racial conflict. Clear examples, of course, are the US and South Africa. But if we take seriously Mahmoud Mamdani's intervention that apartheid and its lasting effects was indeed the norm rather than an exception in colonial Africa, a point which I demonstrate in the book, and that the consequences of slavery in the Americas are just as important for the continent, the African continent, then we are forced to rethink the ways we have approached the continent and African diaspora studies. The book then is an ethnography of racialization and is based on more than 5 years of accumulated formal ethnographic research in Accra and Cape Coast, Ghana, as well as archival research in Ghana, England, and the US. It is also the result of insights gained from my engagement with Ghana spanning almost 2 decades. I'm dating myself here. I know you all thought I was 20. Beginning with my first experience as an undergraduate exchange student. Together, the chapters examine the historical forces and contemporary practices that shape the terrain of struggle, the prevailing racial order within which Ghanaian urban communities and identities are constituted. 4 of the 7 chapters are ethnographic and focus on different sites of racialization. The first, second, and 6th chapters are historical and theoretical in content and work to bring into dialogue the fields of anthropology, African studies, post-colonial studies, and African diaspora studies. Chapter 1 uses the context of the formalization of colonial rule in the Gold Coast, which is what Ghana was formerly known as, to present a theoretical discussion on the creation of the African native as an active process of racialization. The goal here is to locate racialization as a key process in a long historical arc of Europe's relationship with Africa and Africans, and an arc that links slavery and colonialism, which is an important part of the project. Chapter 2 extends the historical analysis from colonialism to the political economy of racialization at the dawn of independence, and establishes in detail the relationship between decolonization and racialization, and the impact of the contemporary moment. The following 4 chapters each focus on a particular racial project and on distinct sites of Ghanaian racial formation. Chapter 3 examines the position of whites and Europeans and the discourses of practices around notions of whiteness. Chapter 4 interrogates the practice of chemical skin bleaching and attendant local dynamics of light skin color privilege. Chapter 5 considers the Ghanaian state's active promotion of heritage tourism and diaspora relations through a discursive deployment of its Pan-Africanist history. And Chapter 6 maps out local Ghanaian interactions with populations of African descent from the diaspora. The ethnographic chapters are ordered in a way that demonstrates the necessarily complex, uneven, and incomplete nature of racial formation in Ghana. For example, the study of white positionality, the discourse of whiteness, and skin bleaching work to demonstrate and reinforce the effects of global white supremacy in Ghana. At the same time, however, the Ghanaian state's conscious affirmation of blackness through its rearticulation of Pan-Africanism and black racial pride, as well as the ongoing interaction among Ghanaian and diaspora black populations in Ghana, work to challenge the very hegemony of white racial privilege. As they struggle for hegemony in the cultural and political field, these individual racial projects are never complete. It remains to be seen, therefore, how the interplay of these projects under study, along with various other projects, will continue to shift the terrain of Ghanaian racial formation. Race Across the Atlantic reveals, nevertheless, that Ghanaian politics and culture continue to be structured in a way that works to reinscribe Ghana's marginality within various racialized global hierarchies. The 7th and final chapter of the book brings together the thesis on global processes of racialization with my 2 primary fields of engagement, African studies and African diaspora studies, and ends with a call to rethink our conceptualization of black internationalisms. So I will focus the rest of this presentation on the themes of this final chapter, a historical and theoretical reflection on the book's relationship with these 2 fields. The research in the book emerged out of my frustration as an anthropology graduate student in the late 1990s with the field of African diaspora studies. Coming on the heels of the rise of the Afrocentric movement, new directions in African diaspora scholarship attended to both provide a counterpoint to Afrocentrism's conception of Africa and to destabilize conventional understandings of the origins and contents of cultural practices of transnational black communities. Scholars articulating this new shift in prominent strands of diaspora studies were particularly steadfast in what would become the field's characteristic stance against essentialisms. Since many of the discussions of diaspora identity began with the baseline establishment of the African continent as the site or origin of the homeland for Black communities, resulting from the European trade in Africans, I wondered about the place of modern Africa in theorizations of the African diaspora. Indeed, with this prominent formulation of the African diaspora, there was no theoretical space allotted for understanding continental African racialized experiences of slavery, of colonialism, of continued racialization in a post-colony. Nor was there space for interrogating African subsequent racialization through both post-colonial voluntary immigration to Europe capitalist centers, right, as we see now in terms of like the massive migration of Africans to Spain and the rest of Europe, and importantly, the mutual construction of global Black identities on both sides of the Atlantic. Hence, discussions of the Black experience within African diaspora studies often did not include contemporary Black African experience, even as it is clear that continental Africans have always been and continue to be racialized as Black in a global order that denigrates Blackness and exploits and dehumanizes Black peoples. Moreover, there was no actual engagement with the continent beyond its either dismissal for the sake of essentialism in configurations of diasporic identity, or the obligatory establishment of Africa as the baseline or motherland of the diaspora. Here, diaspora scholars are not alone. With extremely few exceptions, especially outside of Southern Africa, scholars of continental Africa do not engage the complex ways that race continues to be significant among such communities at this post-colonial moment. If we take anthropology specifically, we find that the discipline's dubious role in racing and exoticizing Africa rarely translates into theoretical discussions of racialized African social cultural structures of meaning. A quick scan of recent ethnographic studies of various African societies will quickly reveal that in the wealth of preferred Africanist topics of engagement, such as globalization, nationalism, ethnicity, ritual, and folklore, witchcraft is big here, the failed state, race and processes of racialization largely do not figure into these analyses. A search for reference on race in Africa sends the researcher almost exclusively to Southern Africa and sometimes to colonial East Africa, areas with white settler populations. Africa is written out of the contemporary racial legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, European colonization, and racialized forms of capital, as well as its continued dialogic relations to the diaspora. But here again, Africanists are operating within a broader intellectual terrain, where, as I have argued, race and racialization processes are understood and treated either as inconsequential or as the sole properties of the U.S. and South Africa, societies with established histories of racial conflict. Thus, in my attempts over the years to grapple intellectually and politically with events and relationships that clearly reflect processes of racialization, in the nearly 2 decades since I've been traveling to Ghana, I was confronted with an astonishing irony. Where African diaspora studies generally concerns itself with articulations of race and Blackness, but not directly with Africa, so African studies generally concerns itself with Africa, but not directly with race and Blackness. The Latin American historian Ben Vincent has commented on this irony, that there has become a clear divide between studies that deal with Africa on the one hand, and those that address race and transnational Blackness on the other. Confronting this iron and understanding this divide has become and continues to be a major objective in my research agenda. My view is that there is a theoretical and epistemological problem in African studies and African diaspora studies, one that arises because of 2 interrelated yet distinct issues. First, there's a way that race and processes of racialization are assumed to be important only in self-consciously multiracial and mostly Western societies with clear histories of racial conflict. Thus, a nominally racially homogeneous society without legal apartheid, such as Ghana, for example, is hardly considered a site for the study of race and racialization. Secondly, in our historical conceptualizations of Blackness, there is a sense in which slavery, as in the New World or diaspora, is consistently accorded a primacy that racial colonialism on the African continent isn't. Be that primacy in constituting Black identity in culture or in serving as a key trope of racial terror. Because slavery in the New World is accorded primacy over colonialism in transnational Black identity construction, and because slavery is often considered primarily as the property of African descended populations away from the African continent, it allows for the implication that what Laura Crispin says is that the implication is that the identity and experiences of New World slave-descended black peoples is somehow, by default, seen to contain and represent all modern black experience. Okay? Current conceptualization of blackness, both in African studies and African diaspora studies, are often determined by this understanding of race and certain claims around the legacy of slavery. It is what Laura Crispin would call a conceptualization of New World blackness rather than global blackness. In other words, what we see in our analysis of black populations over the years are important conceptual splits and isolates of slavery versus colonialism, race versus Africa, modern blackness versus African blackness. So what I do in the chapter is trying to figure out how do we get to this point, right? The recognition that there's a common historical displacement and attendant racial distinctions that are constitutive of the modern black experience on both sides of the Atlantic. That's not a novel recognition, right? It was a conceptual and theoretical and empirical and political imperative for early scholars of the global black experience. Yet, if we are to explore popular trends in contemporary diaspora studies, we rarely see the traces of this radical tradition. I'm arguing that this is I'm arguing today that this is not an accidental development. And in order to understand it, we have to think about, extend our historical lenses while bringing together discussions of methodology, epistemology, and the relationships to worldwide narratives, imperatives, to worldwide political imperatives, academic and disciplinary exigencies, and the dynamics of racial knowledge production. So in the late 1970s, the anthropologist Sinclair Drake saw African diaspora studies as an intellectual byproduct of the ideological and political split between what he deemed continental and traditional visions of Pan-Africanism. For Drake, independence from colonialism shifted the priorities of Africans from transcontinental collaboration against racism and imperialism to nation building and continental cooperation. Consequently, the struggle against racial oppression was understood by Drake and others to be primarily an issue for those outside of the continent, for the diaspora, for diaspora blacks. The assumption, of course, is that independence and political sovereignty ushered in an era for continental Africans where issues of race and its connections with imperialism were no longer as important or primary. I suggest, however, that Drake's marking of this shift is important for broader and more substantial reasons beyond the self-conscious recasting of Pan-Africanisms into continental and diaspora elements. Taking the year 1945 as a point of departure, then we can see how Black international cooperation as well as scholarship was transformed through drastic changes in global politics. These changes brought about not only the realignment of relationships among nations and the restructuring of the political economy, but they also helped determine the terms of intellectual engagement for Black studies. And key to the shaping of Black studies were new liberal definitions of race and the popular adoption of the apolitical framing of continental Africa. I trace this lengthy intellectual history in chapter 7 of the book, so you get the book. But here I wanted to point out some important historical and political markers that I believe have determined the contemporary logic of Black studies today. So some of the key historical markers I've pointed to are, within Africa you have political independence, right? But also the retention of neo-colonial economic, political, cultural, and racial relationships that are often not talked about. You have post-colonial nation building in continental Africa, but also the continued contradiction of ethnicity, right? And nation, with ethnicity having been sedimented by indirect rule of colonialism. And then you have Cold War and the communist influence. In the diaspora, what you have is a demise of the Black radical left. So for example, the Council of African Affairs was completely shut down. And then what you have was the rise of the American Society of, I forgot, AMSAC, which is the study of culture, right? So you shift from the study of imperialism, political economy, to studying African culture, right? Which makes a big difference. And then you have, and that was really driven by the rise in McCarthyism, Cold War, repression against dissent, and then the rise of civil rights and Black power in diaspora studies. So the concurrent intellectual and political shifts that happen as a result of these historical moments are, the first thing is, there's an epistemological shift in African studies. So before before African independence, African studies was done in black universities primarily, right, by black scholars. What happens then, what you have is the transcontinental Africanist and continental traditions of black scholars before the 1960s were shifted when the U.S. government set up area studies departments, the 9 African studies centers, including the UCLA as one of the key ones, right? Sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. So what you have is a new hegemonic conceptualization of Africa in the U.S. So you have, and then the U.S.-based Africanist representations led by anthropologists and political scientists really shifted, this framework for scholarship. So the intellectual focus then went from imperialism to talking about African nationalism, and then to focus on very detailed cultural manifestations within the African continent. At the same time, you have the liberal retreat from race, and the rise of the hegemony of liberal views on race. So you go from race, you don't talk about white supremacy and imperialism. You talk about race relations, racial conflict. There's a shift from imperialism to ethnic conflict and tribal conflict, right, on the African continent. And then you have the rise of African diaspora studies as distinct from African studies. And then you have black cultural nationalism, Afrocentricity, cultural studies, and where we ended by the end of 2000 is anti-essentialism, right? British cultural studies and diaspora studies, what really shifted the focus from Africa in very clear ways. When viewed through a long historical lens, the significant theoretical and epistemological consequences of these developments for black studies are as follows. First, there's a shift in the treatment of race where the analytical lens narrows and moves away from a focus on the interconnected realities of global white supremacy. Second, there's a shift in the treatment of Africa where culture against structure and against race becomes the primary lens through which the continent is apprehended. And third, there's a clear bifurcation in the scholarship and research on continental Africa and on the African diaspora. An important related consequence of these shifts is, as I have already mentioned, is the isolated treatment of the transatlantic slave trade and hemispheric colonialism and slavery on the one hand, and European colonialism on the African continent on the other hand. This is a move that not only links issues of race primarily to the experience of enslavement in the New World, but also gives the New World ownership of that history, while it simultaneously excludes it from post-colonial Africa. My primary intellectual objective continues to be to compel a critical discussion on the politics and dynamics of black internationalism. And my goal in this book was to draw on the processes of racialization in Ghana, to argue that research and analysis in both African studies and African diaspora studies must be deployed as integral and intertwined parts of a broader discussion of global racial formations. Such a move requires, first, the recognition that transnational connections between Africa and the diasporas are significantly marked by the integument of race. Second, it demands the expansion of our historical lens, whereby the events of slavery and colonialism are reconsidered as integrated realities within the longue durée of European empire making, and where therefore we are forced to map together the enslaved blackness of the New World with the colonized blackness of the Old World. In the currents of post-European encounter history, the experiences of black Africa continue to be rendered readable through those of the black diaspora. When we think about global processes of racialization, we have to realize that they are significant because they are historically relevant. It is the common race-inflected patterns that bind the flows of Afro-Atlantic movement and relations. The same patterns also shape Ghana's marginalized position in global political relations. In remapping race to reach contemporary continental Africa in order to acknowledge its modernity and coevalness, we gain a true sense of post-colonial Ghana's and Africa's agency, as well as its role as a crucial site and partner of diasporic circulation and contact. And importantly, this question of race and racialization should also frame our understanding of the difficult geopolitical refashioning of Africa at the beginning of the 21st century. The war on terror, the growing influence of BRICS nations in the struggle over the continent's resources, the question of both African mercenaries in Libya and the lynching of black Libyans during the NATO-led war to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, the U.S. military encroachment through AFRICOM, or the continent's position as a battleground for the Arab Spring, even though it happened on the African continent, all these events pivot on the axis in politics of race and power. Thank you. Okay, open it up.
I'll start us off. Great presentation. I really enjoyed that. I want to know more. You know. Anyway, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the comment you made in passing toward the beginning of the presentation about the propaganda, the exhibits in Ghana about the achievement of African Americans. And I'm thinking about you know, the visits by, you know, prominent African Americans to the continent, you know, intellectuals, artists, athletes, etc., who are there, of course, to kind of share their experiences here in the U.S. and other parts of the diaspora. Can you talk about sort of the impact of the propaganda against possible counter-narratives about what's really happening here? I'm really curious to see, you know, what the ultimate impact of the propaganda was, you know, in this campaign of continued, you know, imperialism, you know, in a supposedly post-colonial period. Well, I mean, actually, what period were we talking about?
This is the 60s.
So it was
right,
the 60s, so it's right after,
60s,
right after
after
independence.
independence.
Okay, all right. So what was the kind of the interplay of those competing possibly competing narratives?
Right. Well, what's interesting is that the propaganda worked very well because it actually diminished the significance of African American concerns around racism in the U.S. Right. So people would say, well, even it might be bad, but look at how much you guys have achieved, and it was really very popular in terms of constructing really a particular kind of the trope of the African American. And I have a whole chapter that talks about the trope of the African American in Ghana, and that comes from these, you know, not just the propaganda, from even before. So the British colonial government used to show minstrel shows. Right? Blackface, minstrelsy, those were the ones that people saw in films in terms of like representations of African Americans. So you have, between that, you have all these intellectuals coming as well as spies, right? Because there's a time where it was black people hired by the CIA to spy for Ghana. So it did two things. It diminished the significance of, I think, the protest here for people on the ground because it made it seem like it wasn't as bad, right? But it also created a very stereotypical view of what the African American is. It led to this idea of this trope. And so even now, the Ghanaian, there's a chapter I talk about the Ghanaian government's deployment of Pan-African history to do heritage tourism. So basically reach out to the diaspora blacks to come in and come to the motherland and visit the dungeons, right? Because Ghana has about 47, right, of them. And so what they do is, this discussion is about African American rising, right? It's redemption, and then there are the Josephs. I don't know if you guys know the Bible. So there's a project called the Joseph Project, which is, if you know the story of Joseph in the Bible, you guys know, anyone know the story of the Joseph in the Bible? Well, what it is I should know my Bible better, but what it is I think it's Abraham's, I think, had 12, is it 12 sons? Do you guys remember? 12 sons, and Joseph was his favorite. And his brothers basically, you know, stole his beautiful coat that the father had gotten him and basically left them, you know, and so then he was taken into captivity into Egypt, you know, and so the brothers did that because they hated him. But then there's a famine that falls upon the land, and then the people travel this time to Egypt, and by this time Joseph had been adopted by I think the queen or the king, and then had become a big leader, you know, in Egypt, and so basically saved these former brothers. They didn't recognize them until much later. But the point of that, the idea that the African Americans are the Josephs, tells you all kinds of things, right, in terms of what this trope means, and what that means in terms of the construction of this Ghanaian identity around race, blackness, and what blackness means.
Can you tell us, where should Black Studies go then? I mean, what should be the organizing features as we move forward? Is a whole new generation of scholars coming into Black Studies. It seems like your book is an important marker in directionally for us to be rethinking Black internationalism. So
Right.
tell us.
Right, well,
what
my
to do.
point is to just think about what's happened, right? It's just,
Yeah.
we think slavery and we think slavery, and we think slavery U.S. We don't even think slavery hemispherically,
Right.
right? Which is fascinating, right? Considering Brazil had the largest
Slave trade.
right, Black population, right, and enslaved. And so part of that is to think about, you know, lately there have been all these conferences on the aftermath of slavery. My point is colonialism on the African continent is part of the aftermath of slavery, because
Right.
it's because of the end of the
Right.
slave trade that the British were able, to get together with the European powers and colonize the African continent. So part of that is the first thing is to go back to what earlier scholars were doing. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, with their earlier books. So Carter G. Woodson has this book called An African Background Outline. Du Bois has The Negro. So where people were talking about empire, white supremacy, and political economy, right, and structuring lives of people. And so I think Black Studies needs to first think about empire and white supremacy globally, right? Go beyond the nation-state paradigm. And from there, then you can see all the parallels. It's very easy, because when Libya was being attacked by NATO, what was fascinating was the stereotype, so you had these Twitter accounts of these supposed Libyans are like, the Africans are coming and they're raping our women. And I'm like, wait, Libya's in Africa, right? But this whole idea, right, of not thinking, of really, and this of racializing discourse, right? And now with what's happening in Spain, and so we forget that racialization continues to impact the continent. So if we talked about racialization globally, what the structures of white supremacy that actually impact that, it actually, I think, create for better comparative analysis. And so that way, ultimately for me, it's like political mobilization, right, globally. Yeah.
Okay, I love your talk. I'm sorry everyone that I'm just having a fest with your work. Say more for us about African studies and the Africans, like the studies centers, because we know that they're like sites for CIA recruitment kind of globally, right? These centers, and yet they somehow occupy a really distinct place in the university that is not contested in the way that Black Studies is.
Even though these days with funding going away from, Title VI, Department of Defense funding has really gone away from African studies, and some of these, so these programs are going away. It's an untold, there's this, what led me to this was this tiny article by this woman named Deborah Armory that came out in 2002, 2003, where it's like, look, African studies as an American institution, where you talk, what happened was it's a really displacing of Black scholars and funding going to predominantly white scholars doing African studies, but also these white scholars shifting the terms of discussion, shifting the terms of debate. Not to say that there weren't exceptions, right? I always think of like Basil Davidson and all these, radical white scholars, but the institutionalized African studies became, as you can see, extremely white, and they train only predominantly white students, and it really transformed. And it's one thing to train white students only, primarily, but it's the Epistemological project, right? Which was about what kinds of questions we ask. So now we're going to focus on really narrow, and anthropology is very good about that. I mean, there's a section in the book where I just list all the titles of anthropology texts, the whole page, right? It's all about the occult, right? Witchcraft, under some tree. It's just like creates this this very different narrative, right, of the African continent. And I think that was by design, right? Because then it removed the relationship, it removed the discussion away from imperialism and white supremacy in ways that I think impacted what African studies was able to do. And then a lot of these people ended up working for the State Department, USAID, they all became consultants. So it's a huge machine, right, African studies in the US, up until I think very recently. And that, I think, needs to be interrogated. And when you bring it up, I mean, African studies has had its own problems. Like in the 60s, there were this huge protest at the African Studies Conference by African scholars from the continent and Black scholars in the US saying, how is it that, you need to integrate African studies this is 1969 in Montreal. People have written about this. It's a major protest, and it continues to be similar. So so African scholars, except for the one or two, and I can name them, that are chosen by the academic elite, right, in Bembe, and you know, maybe Apia, if you consider them African, right? And so there's a really kind of gatekeeping that happens in African studies that I think needs to be explored and challenged, because that gatekeeping impacts the kind of scholarship.
And how do you challenge that, like at a campus at UCLA, to close that gap?
Right. I have no idea. It's been interesting. When I first started doing this research, and I'm an anthropologist, and so first of all, it's hard to get anthropologists to talk about race because they think we've done that, now we do culture, right? Even though the idea of culture is very racialized, right? So that's a whole other conversation. So, but I would go to conferences and present and talk about race in Ghana, and they'd be like, well, why are you imposing a Black American notion of race on Africa? Africans don't want to, you know, they deal with ethnicity, they deal with tribes. Africans they don't know anything about race. So you're imposing this, right? And so part of what the book had to do, which seemed like a basic thing, was to actually go back and show that, first of all, that race is global, that we are all impacted by European expansion, right, and imperialism. So I had to do that, and then say, because race is global, and then race is global because of slavery and colonialism, right? Then Ghana, as every society is racialized, including Ghana. That's how I was able to go around and make, and you know, a case that can't be argued against necessarily, instead of just saying, well, there's race in Africa. Even though when you go, you see it, right? I mean, everywhere. If you go, you see it in your face in terms of practices. If you're standing in line at the bank, it still happens to me today. You know, if I go to Ghana, I'm standing in line at the bank. A white man can come behind me, he will get served first, right? And I always have, you know, I get upset, I scream, you know, but then I become the ugly Black American, right? So that's that.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to follow up on the connection between race and culture, and from your experiences and your travels there, and the theory that you created, like, what role has like diasporic cultural productions played in racial formations in Ghana?
Well, definitely. I mean, that's key, and that's what most people focus on, actually. Yeah. You know, so people talk about hip hop and you know, R&B and soul. There's this famous, people don't know about this. 1971, there's this thing called the Soul to Soul concert, where all the famous, like Ike and Tina and all these people from the U.S. flew to Ghana to do this concert, right, in Accra, I think 1971, and it's like at the height of, like, you know, a military dictatorship. But nevertheless, that was cultural production has never stopped, right? One of the authors that really impacted, the small essay I read when I was in grad school, and it's in the Apia and Gates African American, the Encyclopedia Africana, and it's an essay by Randy Maturi called Afro-Atlantic Dialogue on and it basically says, look, people in the Western Hemisphere and the African continent have always been in conversation and contact with one another. And so he has this other great essay called The English Professor of Brazil. So what you think of like this traditional Yoruba, for example, identity, was actually based on these, you know, Brazilians who went back to Nigeria. You know, Africans had been enslaved in Brazil, went back to Nigeria, and helped spark this 18th century Renaissance around Yoruba identity, right? And so he demonstrates this over and over again and says, like, there's always been these kinds of interaction through cultural production, through politics, that we don't really write about. And it's not about, you know, we all get along. He's like, they've always been marked by power differentials and, you know, sometimes animosity and so on and so forth, but there's always been that kind of interaction, and those interactions have always been impacted by global racial formations, right? Because if you think about the way that the U.S. government impacts those kinds of interactions, the British colonial government showed blackface, all these things, so they're mediated. These interactions are there, but they're also mediated by power. So it requires not these direct, I think, you know, it requires us to actually broaden our studies, to study power and structures.
Was the Soul to Soul concert, was that the one where Muhammad Ali was also in Ghana?
I don't know if he was, no, that wasn't it, because he was in, was it Zimbabwe? Was it the Rumble in the Jungle? What was that?
Zaire. But I thought, okay.
No, he
I
wasn't.
got
There's
the
actually,
concert.
I'll find it for you. There's a documentary on the
Yeah,
Soul to Soul.
yeah, that's what I'm, yeah.
Concept, but he wasn't there. It was solely singers, and then they met with their Ghanaian counterparts and did this huge concert in 1971.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, sure.
Why not?
That's great.
China. So
China.
we've got the new Scramble for Africa, right? China, and I study this with the extraction and mining industries that impact information technology fields. So how can we reimagine? I mean, I feel like one of the ways that it's difficult to talk about China's kind of continued and also persistent always engagement with modern, with kind of pre and post-colonial Africa, we could say, is that it's hard for people to understand power and a political economy of China in the West, not only like what's happening right here in the United States, but also on the continent. So what do we need to be thinking about or paying attention to there?
Right. Well, two things. One of them is that the U.S. military is the most powerful force on the African continent right now. And the U.S. military has slowly, through AFRICOM, which is the Africa Command, and they're in every single country, and they come in as, we're going to help the NGOs build this, do that. It's like soft power, right? But they are there, fully armed, training local proxies. That's directly against China, right? Let's be clear, right? So there's a war on terror, that's war on terror, which it was aggravated because NATO bombed Libya and just deposed Gaddafi, which sent all these arms and different groups south, right? So you have the destabilization. So what's happening is that. The other thing is that the Chinese presence in Ghana is fascinating in that there's an animosity versus the Chinese that you don't see towards the Europeans. And part of that has to do with the fact that there's always been middlemen on the African continent and the Caribbean. So you have the Lebanese, and I talk about that in the book. So the Lebanese were brought in as the middlemen, the Lebanese, the Indians, the Chinese. So they've been there for a long time. Now that China is growing into, and so as you know, the middlemen are always the ones that are more hated than the actual, right? Because the side of power is hidden, right? So what you see are the people who are working, selling you the clothes and the cloth, and they're the Lebanese. And the virulent racism of the Lebanese and the Indians and the Chinese against the Africans are much more open, right? So people see it. There's all kinds of discussions around anti-Ghanaian. There's Chinese who were illegally mining gold recently, and then the community approached them and they shot dead, they were armed and they shot dead like 4 Ghanaians, and so then the Ghanaian government had to deport a whole bunch of illegal Chinese, and so there's all this stuff already happening. So, and that's why I say, racial formation, we have to think about it as not something that's like, that's not movable, right? Because things change, right? So I talk about, I focus on 4 sites of racial formation, right? But there are others I could have talked about, like the Lebanese, like New China. And so what it does is to really think about how things are changing, especially in relation to the rise of the U.S. military, the war on terror, and then this resources that brings not only China, but the white South Africans since the end of apartheid who own half the businesses nowadays in a lot of these places. And so part of that is so if we think about racialization and power and political economy in this broad sense, then we can actually do better analysis that put all these things at play and gives us, better ways to do comparative stuff.
So my question is, I'm thinking about, I guess, the way you talk about anthropologists, but a lot of scholars just pushing back against your work about race in Africa, because a lot of times it's focused on ethnicity. I guess how have African scholars on the continent, or even like African scholars who are in America, Europe, how have they received your work?
It's interesting. The older generation, you have to understand like racial knowledge production, because I went to one conference when I was still a graduate and trying to like work through my, and I was in Senegal working through my theoretical thing, and I tried to present on like whiteness in Ghana. And the people who jumped back at me were all these African scholars who were also sponsored, right, brought in by these U.S. academics, right? So first of all, you have to understand the political economy of the African Academy. There's no money, so you know the goal is to get a fellowship in the U.S. Here and there, the tanks are all funded by either the Netherlands, France, and so on. So there's already that political economy where you can't necessarily challenge that. There have been quite a number of African scholars who've challenged this particular kind of framing, but I do think even African scholars don't agree that race is analytically significant. So I start the book with a story. I'm sitting there at I think the equivalent of the chancellor at the University of Ghana, and you know I've known him since I was an undergrad. So so I went back to do my research. So we're talking. He's like, so what are you doing here? I'm like, oh, I'm here to study race in Ghana. And he starts laughing. And he's like, well, that's an American problem. What are you talking about? So part of that is thinking about, you know, so people see class. So part of that is even on the African continent, people will tell you it's not about race, even though, and that's the beauty about doing ethnography, is that people will tell you one thing and do another, right? So even though you get all these discourses around racial difference, around whiteness, but they'll say it's not about race. So it's been an interesting thing. What's also been interesting has been the African students in Europe who actually responded to the book more than anyone else, which has been interesting in terms of thinking about race. So I'm thinking the new generation that's trained outside might have something different to say. But the reviews on the African continent haven't been bad, but it's been by South Africans, so they understand. I think it's time, right? Thank you, guys.